Welcome to Chapter 50 of Mashle Magic and Muscle, Mash Bernadette and the Protein Shake-Up. This chapter was the conclusion of the first trial for the Divine Visionary exam, and a setup for a potential antagonist for the foreseeable future. Starting off, this chapter has a color page of Mash putting on his jacket. When Mash isn't doing his deadpan expression, he can actually look pretty cool, and crimson background with what looks like droplets of blood seeping down behind him really makes him pop out, and acts as a sort of foreshadowing for this chapter. On the first page we see Lance lifting one of the balloons along with the structure it's attached to up into the air, before causing a great amount of suction around the opening, causing air to be rapidly sucked into it, and on the second page we see it violently pop as the frame it was attached to crashed back into the ground as Lance catches the key and looks at it without even seeming all that fazed. I wonder where the dead servants have gone. Certainly using such a violent method would have been enough to catch their attention, and they are supposed to be immune to magic, so how did he manage to keep them away long enough to pull that off? We can imagine he would have figured something out, but it is a bit disappointing not to see it. The third page has Seeing Dot using his magic to explode his balloon and retrieving his key. Seems like this is going a bit quick, but I suppose Mash is the main character, and so now that he has retrieved his own key, we need to pick up the pace and get the rest of the cast in position for the next exam. On the same page we see Finn, now hiding behind a wall and doing nothing. At this point I am starting to wonder if he will ever end up doing anything at all, or if the author has any plans for him at all. We also see that Margaret has unsurprisingly retrieved his key already. No doubt he could figure out how to do so. If he got eliminated here without actually getting to meet Mash, I would be very disappointed. On the fourth page we see a chibi Mash and Max having a momentary celebration about getting the key, before Max comments that he is glad that their plan worked, even if he did not think they would make it. Mash nervously responds to the confusion of Max before offering the key to him, which only serves to stun him even more. On the fifth page Mash puts on his deadpan face, saying that they got the key because of Max, so he should get to use it. Okay Mash, we know you're not the sort to take credit for things or even act like selfishly in most cases, but your life is on the line here. You should be a bit more selfish here, or else you are going to get yanked around by someone. Max seems taken aback for a moment as he stared at him with wide eyes before closing his eyes with almost a resignedness as he comments that Mash is a good person. Mash, still with his deadpan expression, denies that fact, despite it being clear as day that he is a good person. Obviously he cannot take compliments, something he needs to work on in the future to be a more rounded character. On page 6 Max tells him to take the key while having a shot that looks like the sort of a character might get after a revolution or before they die. You can even see the typical leaves flowing in the background. I'd even bet that if this ever gets an anime, they would be cherry blossoms and the entire background would turn white. But anyway, Mash is surprised by the idea, with Max telling him which way the exit is, so he should go on ahead, as apparently there is a rumor that time is a factor in your ranking. Mash attempts to protest, but Max is not having it. He turns away from Mash to head off. As he does so he tells Mash that Rain told him about Mash. He tells him how he did not believe that Mash was as good a person as he said, and now that he knows the mechanics, he could handle himself. Interesting. I wonder what sort of relationship he has with Rain. They're both in order, but from his words it seems like they have a deeper relationship than just being in the same house, and now I think that Max went out of his way to seek out Mash during the exam to test what sort of character he really was for himself. On page 7, Max tells Mash that he has to let him prove himself because of his selfish desire to help people like him, so he should not worry. Mash seems a bit sad at the prospect of leaving him, which causes Max to let out a small chuckle, before telling Mash that he is his senior, so Mash as his junior must help him keep his honor. It is good both for the story and the world building to have at least a couple people who had not had any prior experience with Mash being willing to come around to helping him even after knowing he can't use magic. On page 8, Mash is silently thoughtful for a moment, before simply responding with K before turning and leaving with a small thank you. Mash is not the sort to have an emotional moment, especially not with someone he just met, but I think that he really appreciates what Max has done for him. As Mash leaves him, Max remains standing in the same spot, letting out a small sigh of relief. He turns around before beginning to head off. Page 10. Max walks alone through the woods only to suddenly stop and turn around as a gash appears on the right side of his forehead just above his eyebrow. He seemed to have been expecting it from the way he kept glanced back. On page 11, Max turns around as he covers the wound on his forehead with his hand, while commenting that his premonition was right. Carpaccio Luo Yang of Orco emerges in all his glory, ready to face off against Max without a word. Page 12, Max questions Rain in his head if he did his best for the younger students before raising his wand out towards Carpaccio while telling for him to come on then, with only getting an eerie silence in return. I do not know if I'm just a sucker for the archetype or what, but Max has just jumped up a few levels in terms of characters I personally like in this series. I am really glad he turned out to be a decent human being. And throwing himself onto the metaphorical sword for Mash certainly helps. On page 13 we see Mash emerging from a large magical gate as the announcer declares that the candidates are making their way back. And as he emerges, another student offers him a towel and a drink so that he can rest up for the next test. Mash gives her a small thank you, and you can call me cynical, but I think it is a bit odd that he is getting the same treatment as the other contestants, and if someone wanted to mess with him, poisoning his drink would be a good way to do it. But enough of my distrustful thoughts. Dot and Finn have both made it back, both wheezing, with Dot supporting Finn over his shoulder, Finn still crying. Dot explains that the explosions work on the balloon, only for Mash to comment on the fact they are all beat up. Lance comments on how he was surprised that Mash was able to tackle the challenge without magic, only for Mash to respond that he had help. At this point I am thinking that we might never see Finn's magic until a vitally important point in the story, or it could be used as a running joke with no payoff. I hope it is the former, or I'm going to be disappointed, and it had better be something epic. On page 14 Mash thinks on why Max sent him on ahead, seemingly having noticed that something was going on with him. Lance attempts to question him on if something is wrong. Whatever Mash was going to say ends up unfinished as the announcer declares that only 9 of the candidates can pass on to the next round, and as we see Max emerge from one of the gates, Mash telling Lance that was him, we carry on to page 15. Revealing the fact that Max was in the middle of collapsing in a puddle of blood as Carpaccio stands over him as the announcer questions if he needed to go so far in his beating of Max. Obvious, he did not, but as he explains on page 16 as he stamps down on Max's head, he does not have any need for weaklings because weaklings are useless. That is a concept in direct opposition to Mash's thought processes. He does not care if someone is strong or weak. Because in Mash's case he would be considered weak by the world because he does not have magic when he is in fact strong in his own way. Everyone has their own strengths and weaknesses. Despite his rather relaxed demeanor, this is something Mash seems to understand, at least on a personal level. On page 17 Carpaccio continues to explain that because they are weak it should not matter what he does to them, all while having an almost blank face, speaking with an absolute certainty. A certainty I cannot wait to see Mash crush with his own 2 fists. Mash is already taking an issue with Carpaccio as he tells him to stop standing on Max's head or he is going to get punched. And furthermore, Mash questions if he needed to go so far. To which Carpaccio stares at him blankly as if the words were just going in one ear and out the other. And as Finn watches on, he remembers how Carpaccio is one of the top continuing students of the year, just like Lance. We all know how a fight between Lance and Mash went down, and I do not see this playing out any differently except maybe with Carpaccio getting a much-deserved kick in the balls. On page 18 we get a scene of the 2 of them stood opposite one another with an empty white background. It looks very much like something you might get when rivals start to stare each other down. But I do not think Carpaccio will be a rival to Mash for a long time, maybe only for this arc. Following on from that moment, Carpaccio picks up the goblet offered to him as the crowd of students all looked alarmed as he threw the contents towards Mash, telling him that weaklings should be quiet. It is curious that the younger individuals seem concerned or at the very least upset or worried about his actions. I would not have thought that they would care if it concerned Mash. On page 19, Mash catches the water in a flask he was holding as he pours some sort of protein powder from a cardboard container he was holding before he put the lid on the flask and began to rapidly shake it, much to the crowd's dismay. On page 20, Mash apologizes, saying that it's time for his 3 p.m. homemade special muscle drink, to which everyone seems to have the same thought of it being a protein shake. As Mash explains that the secret is powdered beans since they are rich in protein, Finn is just thinking about how scary it is that he was able to react fast enough to turn it into a protein shake. Which is honestly fair, given how despite this being a comedic moment, it is still another showing of the absurd body that Mash possessed, that he could catch water mid-fall from a completely neutral position without any apparent effort on his part. And while Finn and no doubt everyone else is in shock over what Mash continues to talk to Carpaccio, telling him that it is important to stick to a schedule when it comes to protein. But more importantly that he is calling people weaklings. Continuing on to page 21, Mash tells him he has never met someone stronger than him. To which Carpaccio ends the chapter with a bland if slightly dismissive look on his face. This chapter served more to set up an antagonism between Mash and Carpaccio, as well as keep us informed on the fact that not everyone is so unwilling to have their perceptions of Mash tested, as proven by Max's willingness to sacrifice himself for Mash after he proved himself. With that said and done, this has been my review of Mashle Magic and Muscle chapter 50.